By the autumn of 1942, the naval war in the Pacific had entered a phase where engagements were increasingly decided not by overwhelming force, but by fragmented encounters fought under conditions of extreme uncertainty. The surface actions around the Solomon Islands, particularly in the waters later known as Iron Bottom Sound, were rarely clean confrontations between evenly matched fleets. Instead, they were confused, violent night battles involving small task groups, incomplete intelligence, and commanders forced to make decisions with minutes to spare. Radar was new and unevenly understood, communications were fragile, and doctrine lagged behind the realities of combat. In this environment, the margin between obedience and initiative narrowed to a razor's edge. On the night of 12-13 November 1942, a U.S. Navy destroyer captain found himself facing a situation that doctrine had not fully prepared him for. His ship was smaller, more lightly armored, and outgunned by the Japanese surface forces operating in the area. Standing orders emphasized caution, screening duties, and avoidance of decisive engagement unless explicitly directed. Yet within minutes, the tactical picture would shift in a way that left no time for consultation. What followed was not a reckless act of bravado, nor a misunderstanding of orders, but a deliberate choice to disregard explicit instructions in favor of an aggressive maneuver that carried an extremely high probability of destruction. The waters north of Guadalcanal were crowded that night. Japanese naval forces were attempting once again to bombard Henderson Field. The airstrip, whose continued operation threatened Japanese supply lines and troop movements throughout the central Solomons. Previous attempts had demonstrated that daylight resupply was nearly impossible under Allied air superiority. As a result, the Imperial Japanese Navy relied heavily on night surface actions, using cruisers and destroyers to deliver troops and shell American positions under cover of darkness. These operations were conducted with precision and confidence, built on years of training in night fighting and torpedo warfare. The American forces opposing them were still adapting. The U.S. Navy had radar, but its integration into command decision-making was inconsistent. Some commanders trusted it implicitly, others distrusted it entirely. Night fighting doctrine was evolving in real time, often shaped by the outcomes of engagements rather than by pre-war planning. In this transitional phase, destroyers occupied a particularly dangerous role. They were fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed with torpedoes, but they lacked the armor to survive sustained gunfire from cruisers or battleships. Their value lay in screening, reconnaissance, and opportunistic attacks, not in prolonged surface duels. The U.S. destroyer involved that night was operating as part of a mixed force assigned to intercept Japanese ships approaching Guadalcanal. Its captain was an experienced officer, trained in pre-war doctrine that emphasized adherence to command hierarchy and coordinated action. Orders issued earlier in the evening were clear: maintain position within the screen, avoid independent engagement, and preserve the integrity of the formation. The objective was to delay and disrupt the Japanese, not to engage decisively at close range. Shortly before midnight, radar contacts began to appear. Japanese ships were approaching at speed, their formation difficult to discern in the cluttered returns. The American task group attempted to organize a coordinated response, but communications were strained. Conflicting reports, overlapping commands, and the inherent difficulty of interpreting early radar displays under combat conditions created confusion. Within minutes, it became apparent that Japanese cruisers were closing the distance faster than anticipated. As the range decreased, visual contact was established. The silhouettes of large Japanese warships emerged against the faint glow of the night sky. These were not destroyers or transports. They were heavy units capable of delivering devastating gunfire. Among them was at least one Japanese cruiser, armed with multiple 8-inch guns and escorted by destroyers carrying the highly effective Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes. In a direct engagement, the American destroyer stood little chance of survival. The captain of the destroyer received updated orders instructing him to maintain his assigned station, and prepare to withdraw if the Japanese advanced aggressively. The intent was to avoid exposing individual ships to concentrated enemy fire. Yet as the Japanese formation continued to close, it became increasingly clear that adherence to these orders would leave the task group vulnerable. The cruiser's approach threatened to cut across the American line, potentially isolating ships and allowing Japanese gunners to engage at will. At this moment, the captain faced a dilemma that would define the action. Remaining in position meant preserving compliance with orders, but risking the annihilation of the larger force. Charging the enemy meant violating explicit instructions and placing his own ship directly in the path of overwhelming firepower. The decision had to be made quickly. There was no time to request clarification, and no guarantee that higher command fully understood the rapidly changing tactical situation. The captain chose to act independently. He ordered his destroyer to increase speed and turn toward the Japanese cruiser, accelerating into an attack run that brought his ship directly across the enemy's projected path. This maneuver was not standard. Destroyer doctrine emphasized surprise, torpedo attack from advantageous angles, and immediate withdrawal. Charging head-on reduced the margin for error and exposed the ship to concentrated gunfire. Yet it also forced the Japanese cruiser to react, disrupting its approach and complicating its targeting solutions. As the destroyer closed the distance, Japanese searchlights snapped on, illuminating the American ship in stark relief. In naval night battles, searchlights were both a weapon and a risk, revealing targets while also betraying the user's position. The Japanese cruiser opened fire almost immediately. Shells began to fall around the destroyer, geysers of water erupting dangerously close to the hull. The American ship responded with its own guns, firing rapidly but with limited effect against the cruiser's armor. The destroyer's true weapon, however, lay in its torpedoes. As the range dropped, the captain ordered a torpedo spread aimed at the cruiser's anticipated path. Timing and angle were critical. A miscalculation of even a few seconds could render the attack ineffective. The crew executed the launch under intense pressure, aware that they were likely committing themselves to a one-way mission. The Japanese cruiser, faced with an unexpected aggressive charge, began evasive maneuvers. Its gunners attempted to adjust fire, but the destroyer's speed and erratic course complicated targeting. The engagement compressed into a matter of moments. The destroyer passed through a curtain of shellfire, suffering near misses and shockwaves that rattled the hull and knocked men off their feet. Damage reports flooded the bridge, but the ship remained operational. Whether the torpedoes struck their target remains a matter of historical analysis. Some accounts suggest that the cruiser was forced to alter course sharply, avoiding potential hits at the cost of disrupting its planned bombardment run. Others argue that the mere threat of torpedo attack was sufficient to force a disengagement. What is certain is that the Japanese formation's momentum was broken. The cruiser did not continue its approach as intended, and the cohesion of the Japanese force was compromised. The destroyer, having completed its attack run, attempted to withdraw under heavy fire. The captain ordered smoke screens deployed, using the cover to mask his ship's movements. Damage had been sustained, but the ship remained afloat. More importantly, the immediate threat to the American task group had been alleviated. The Japanese cruiser no longer held a clear approach path, and subsequent engagements that night would unfold under different conditions as a result. In the aftermath of the battle, assessments of the captain's decision were mixed. From a strictly doctrinal standpoint, he had violated orders and exposed his ship to unnecessary risk. From a tactical perspective, his action had disrupted a superior enemy force at a critical moment. The outcome could easily have been fatal. That it was not owed as much to circumstance as to judgment. The incident highlighted a recurring theme in early Pacific naval warfare: the gap between pro-war doctrine and wartime reality. Orders issued hours earlier could become obsolete in minutes. Commanders on the scene often possessed a clearer understanding of the immediate tactical picture, than those issuing directives from afar. The ability to recognize when adherence to orders would produce a worse outcome than their violation was not easily taught, nor was it universally accepted. That night off Guadalcanal, a U.S. destroyer captain chose initiative over obedience. He charged a Japanese cruiser in darkness, knowing that his ship was outmatched and that survival was uncertain. His decision did not win the battle outright, nor did it destroy the enemy. What it did was alter the flow of the engagement at a moment when delay and disruption mattered more than destruction. The consequences of that choice would extend beyond the night itself. They would influence how subsequent actions were interpreted, how initiative was valued within the fleet, and how destroyer commanders understood their role in night surface combat. The charge was not an act of desperation. It was a calculated gamble made in the belief that action, however costly, was preferable to inaction that guaranteed disaster. What followed in the hours after the charge, how the destroyer survived, how the Japanese force adjusted, and how higher command reacted to the violation of orders, would reveal much about the evolving nature of command in the Pacific War. In the immediate minutes after the destroyer disengaged under its own smoke, the battle did not resolve into clarity. It fractured further. Night surface actions in the Solomons rarely ended with a decisive conclusion. Instead, they dissolved into overlapping, independent fights shaped by partial visibility and incomplete information. The Japanese cruiser that had been forced to maneuver away from its intended track did not pursue the withdrawing destroyer aggressively. Its captain, suddenly confronted with a torpedo threat at close range, had shifted from an offensive mindset to one of preservation. In the confined waters north of Guadalcanal, a cruiser crippled by torpedoes would be unlikely to escape, and Japanese doctrine placed a high premium on avoiding such losses when bombardment objectives could be postponed. The destroyer's captain, meanwhile, was acutely aware that survival in the next 10 minutes would matter more than justification in the next 10 days. Damage control reports reached the bridge in rapid succession. Several compartments had taken on water from near-miss shock damage. Electrical systems were partially compromised. One gun mount was temporarily disabled. Casualties had occurred, though not in numbers that reduced fighting capability. The ship remained fast maneuverable and capable of continuing the fight if required. That fact alone was remarkable, given the weight of fire it had passed through moments earlier. As the Japanese formation adjusted, the broader American task group gained breathing space. Other U.S. ships were able to maneuver without the immediate pressure of a cruiser bearing down on them at close range. Fire that might have been concentrated on multiple American vessels was now dispersed. The destroyer's charge had not destroyed the enemy, but it had disrupted timing and alignment at a critical juncture. In night actions, where coordination depended on precise sequencing, disruption could be decisive even without sinking a ship. From the Japanese perspective, the encounter was unsettling rather than catastrophic. Their night fighting doctrine assumed that enemy destroyers would either attack from advantageous angles or withdraw quickly under fire. A direct charge, conducted at speed and under illumination, ran counter to expectations. Japanese gunnery officers reported difficulty maintaining firing solutions as the destroyer crossed rapidly through engagement zones. Torpedo officers, trained to respect the lethality of American torpedoes, even if they considered them inferior to their own, pressed for evasive action. The result was hesitation, and hesitation was costly in an operation that depended on momentum. As the night wore on, subsequent engagements unfolded across Iron Bottom Sound. Some American ships were lost, others were damaged. Japanese vessels also suffered losses. The battle as a whole would later be classified as tactically inconclusive, yet strategically significant. Henderson Field remained operational. The Japanese failed once again to deliver a decisive bombardment. In the calculus of the Guadalcanal campaign, that failure mattered more than the precise tally of ships sunk. When daylight came, the destroyer that had charged the cruiser limped back toward safer waters. Its battered appearance bore witness to the risk its captain had accepted. Sailors who had survived the charge moved through routine tasks with the subdued efficiency common after intense combat. There was no celebration aboard. The awareness that the ship had come within seconds of destruction overshadowed any sense of accomplishment. The captain's concerns shifted from survival to accountability. Naval command culture placed immense emphasis on obedience and coordination. Independent action, even when successful, could be interpreted as insubordination if it disrupted broader plans or set dangerous precedents. Reports would have to be written. Decisions would be scrutinized by officers far removed from the immediacy of the night's chaos. The captain understood this. He did not attempt to frame his decision as heroism. In his initial report, he described the circumstances plainly, noting the proximity of the Japanese cruiser, the threat it posed to the task group, and the absence of viable alternatives within the available time. Higher command reactions were cautious rather than punitive. The early Pacific War had already exposed the limitations of rigid doctrine. Several engagements had demonstrated that destroyer captains, who waited for perfect alignment or explicit authorization, often found themselves reacting too late. While the captain's decision technically violated standing orders, it also aligned with the broader operational intent, preventing Japanese surface forces from neutralizing Henderson Field. In this sense, the spirit of the orders had been upheld even as the letter was ignored. This distinction mattered. The U.S. Navy was in the midst of a painful learning process. Postwar assumptions about fleet engagements, command hierarchies, and the predictability of battle were being dismantled by experience. The charge of the destroyer became one more data point in that process. It illustrated that initiative at the point of contact could sometimes achieve what centralized control could not, particularly in environments where communication delays and sensory overload rendered real-time coordination impossible. The Japanese Navy, too, drew lessons from the encounter. Post-action analysis emphasized the need for improved coordination between cruisers and destroyers during night operations, particularly in dealing with aggressive enemy tactics. The assumption that American destroyers would behave predictably had been challenged. While Japanese confidence in their night fighting superiority remained largely intact, cracks had appeared. The enemy was adapting. In the months that followed, destroyer actions in the Solomons continued to reflect this evolution. American commanders became more willing to authorize aggressive torpedo attacks and independent maneuvering when conditions warranted. Training emphasized flexibility and judgment rather than rote adherence to pre-planned formations. Radar integration improved, allowing better situational awareness, though it would never eliminate the fog of war entirely. The captain who had ordered the charge did not become a celebrated figure during the war. His action was recorded, analyzed, and absorbed into the institutional memory of the fleet rather than elevated as a singular act of heroism. This was consistent with naval culture, which tended to value outcomes over personalities. What mattered was not who had made the decision, but whether the decision contributed to operational success. From a historical standpoint, the significance of the charge lies not in the immediate tactical results, but in what it reveals about command under pressure. The destroyer was outgunned, outmatched, and operating under explicit instructions to avoid precisely the kind of engagement it initiated. Yet the captain recognized that the situation unfolding in front of him rendered those instructions inadequate. He did not have the luxury of certainty. He had seconds to choose between compliance and action, knowing that either choice carried severe risk. The charge also underscores the asymmetry inherent in naval warfare. A destroyer could not defeat a cruiser in a gun duel, but it could threaten one with torpedoes and force it to maneuver defensively. That threat, when applied at the right moment, could alter the behavior of a larger force. Naval power was not solely a function of tonnage or firepower, but of how those assets were employed under real conditions. In retrospect, it is tempting to view the captain's decision as inevitable or obvious. It was neither. Many officers placed in similar circumstances chose caution and were destroyed nonetheless. Others acted aggressively and paid the price. That this destroyer survived does not retroactively guarantee that the decision was correct, only that it was effective in that instance. The difference between boldness and recklessness is often visible only after the fact. The waters off Guadalcanal would claim many more ships before the campaign ended. Iron Bottom Sound earned its name through accumulated loss rather than singular moments. Yet within that accumulation are individual decisions that shaped outcomes in subtle ways. The charge of a destroyer at night against a Japanese cruiser was one such decision. It did not turn the tide of the war, but it contributed to a pattern of resistance that ultimately denied the Japanese Navy its objectives in the Solomons. In examining this incident, the temptation to romanticize must be resisted. The captain did not charge because he sought glory or because he believed his ship invincible. He charged because he judged that inaction posed a greater danger than action. That judgment was informed by training experience and an acute awareness of his ship's capabilities and limitations. It was also informed by an understanding that orders, however well-intentioned, could not account for every contingency encountered in combat. By the end of 1942, the U.S. Navy would increasingly acknowledge this reality. Doctrine evolved to grant greater latitude to commanders at the point of contact. Night fighting remained hazardous, but it became less rigid. The lessons learned in the dark waters around Guadalcanal informed later operations across the Pacific, where initiative and adaptability proved decisive. The destroyer's charge stands as an example of how war often rewards those willing to act decisively in uncertainty, not because decisiveness guarantees success, but because hesitation guarantees vulnerability. In the darkness north of Guadalcanal, a U.S. destroyer captain ignored his orders and drove his ship toward a Japanese cruiser. He did so knowing the odds, accepting the consequences, and prioritizing the mission over personal or professional safety. That choice, measured in minutes, echoes far beyond the night in which it was made.